Hey, 2 videos in one day. So I'm doing the second video tonight for 2 reasons. Number 1, I made a mistake. In my previous video, I had reported that the Switch had only sold 1.6 and they assumed it would sell 1.8 million in the United States. Yeah, that 1.8 was the Americas, so I kind of screwed that one up. Oops. But everything else in that video still stands. I imagine those of you that are my usual watchers watch the full thing and understand what I'm talking about when I say everything else in the video still stands, while the other ones that make the video go deeper into the algorithm because they hate me so much, realistically didn't get past the first 30 seconds. So yeah, I wanted to get that correction out of the way, but also because, as is typical when I do a video on this, all of a sudden there's news and there's data and there's numbers, but VG Charts released their numbers and the Switch actually hit 5.01 million units sold according to them. Now, they're not completely accurate. Whenever I use them, the people that generally disagree with me will often tell me that VG Charts is not trustworthy and I'm a faker for using them. But in this case, I'm assuming they're pretty close to it. We'll find out on August 1st when we get the official numbers from Nintendo. And like I said in the previous video, it's very likely that 5 million is possible. I still don't think that 5 million is impressive, but I had a feeling we would be close to it regardless. I was just like, oh, it might be 4.8 million. So yeah, either way, that's besides the point. This thing should technically still keep getting sold out until it hits like 15 to 20 million, because most of these consoles that really do well and they're hard to grab within the first year or two remain sold out immediately once they get to that point. But at the very least now, the Switch 2 is readily available at all times. We can see the actual number. We can figure out if this is even a conversation worth having again. Because the way it seems like to me is that 6 to 8 million that was initially shipped out and produced and everybody predicted is actually sitting in the United States right now, and they're trying to move through the rest of it. So we'll see how long that takes. Now, since everybody likes to so kindly point out that VG Charts has said that the Switch 2 has sold 5 million units, I wanted to point out that they also said that the Switch 2 sold 1.717047 million units in June 2025. That's their estimate anyway. As far as the US is concerned, that's 1.6 million units. So, you know, if you were to subtract the two and do all the math and take out your calculators, you find out that the Switch 2 has sold more units in Japan than it has in the United States. That's new. So to give you an idea, the Switch 1 in its opening 2.74 million sold in its first month, sold twice as much in the Americas as it did in Japan. This time I'm not making a mistake, it was in the Americas. Which means even if you take off that 10 to 20%-ish that it sold in the Americas, outside of the United States, you're still looking at, I don't know what, a little bit less than double the amount that was sold in Japan is being sold in the United States for the Switch 1. Oh, and also, by the way, in Europe, it sold more than it did in Japan as well. Japan was 3rd place. So obviously, Japan is drastically outperforming what the Switch 1 did, not only in sales, because obviously it's outperforming the Switch 1 since it's actually available, but also in the proportions. Drastically. Initially, when we looked at the 3.5 million sales that were being sold, everybody was like, oh yeah, it's nice and even. 1/3 for the Americas, 1/3 for Japan, and 1/3 for Europe/other. And the main reason so many people were adamant that that's the truth and that's gotta be the truth is because the whole argument was that the Switch 2 is cheaper in Japan, and that's why the sales over there are drastically inflated, and it's making the entire world look like it wants the Switch 2 significantly more than it was when the Switch 1 launched. And if you remember on that opening weekend, we didn't have the My Nintendo Stores numbers from Japan. So it was just under 1 million, and then we found out the Switch 2 was at 1.1 million, so they're like, yeah, it's proportional, US is doing better, yada yada yada. Well, now we know after the entirety of the first month has passed, Japan is proving that it's the leader in the entire world for the Switch 2 units sold, even more than the United States, selling just under 3 times as much in the first month as the Switch 1 did. Whereas in the US, while yes, it was an improvement on the previous console's launch, that being the Switch 1, it wasn't 3 times as much, and then Europe was even less than that. Now, here's the question that I'm gonna ask you. Do you think that Japan had more Switch 2s available in the opening month than they had in the United States? Because I wouldn't assume they would. Again, during the launch of the Switch 1 was almost double the amount of units sold in the United States than they were in Japan. And not just that, the total lifetime sales of the Switch 1 are like 58 million to 37-ish million. In favor of the United States, of course. And not just that, Europe outsold Japan as well, even in total lifetime sales, not just on the launch weekend. So basically, people are wondering why I'm saying this thing is underperforming even though it's breaking records. And I think I've shared a lot of data and a lot of information of why I believe so. I'm not just pulling things out of thin air, I'm using headlines. I'm using things that professionals are saying. I'm even using logic, and I'm making a lot of guesses. That's true. I have no access to anything. But logic tells me there's no way in hell they would have more Switch 2s available in Japan than they have in the United States. Logic tells me it probably is not even that close. Like, let's think about this proportionally for a second. The Switch 1 numbers in the Americas are roughly 1.6-ish times the Japan numbers. That's as of December 31st, 2024. In Europe, it's 39 million, which is just about equal. Which means in the Americas, for the Switch 1 outsold Europe by like 1.5 times as many units. And according to these VG charts numbers, once again, in Europe, it says that they sold 1.1 million units in June 2025. So the Switch 2 in the United States has outperformed the Switch 1 by 1.7. So we're within a ballpark here. It's kind of close. It's almost exactly proportional. The idea here is that between United States and Europe, the way their relation is to each other, the proportions are roughly the same as we saw on the Switch 1, both at the time of its launch as well as at the end of its life cycle. And if you consider those first month sales of the Switch 1 minus what was sold in Japan, in the first month in everywhere outside of Japan, the Switch 1 managed 2.14 million units. Meanwhile, the Switch 2 outside of Japan has sold 3.28 million units. Which again, averages out to roughly that same proportion. The Switch 2 has done 1.5 times as many units as the Switch 1 did. So again, everything outside of Japan is pretty consistent. The console has gotten a 50% bump up, and it's a more reasonable looking number. Now also keep in mind that at launch in America and in Europe, the Switch 2 has reportedly done 2 times as much as the Switch 1 has over those first 4 days, which means over the course of a month, the Switch 2 went from having a 2 times lead over the Switch 1 to a 1.5 times lead over the Switch 1. So it's dropping much quicker than the Switch 1 did, but that's fine. That's a different discussion. Anyway, my point is that if you take out Japan, the Switch 2 has only sold 1 million units more than the Switch 1 did, or just a little over 1 million units. Now, 1 million is a lot, or I guess technically it's 1.15 million. That's a decent amount. The problem though is that the Switch 2 has outsold the Switch 1 in those first months of sales by 2.27 million, which means roughly 1.12 million extra units were sold in Japan in comparison to the Switch 2, which basically means when you're looking at it worldwide, almost half of the entirety of these additional sales in comparison to the Switch 1 that happened for the Switch 2 were from Japan. This all tells a massive story. Number one, it tells us that in Japan, where Furukawa is clearly putting all of his efforts in, they're still very happy. The Switch 2 is cheaper. They're treating them better over there, apparently. So naturally, it's completely selling out. And that's the assumption, right? Is that it's probably sold out in Japan. So let's say their predictions were correct about Japan. This is how much they thought they would sell in the first month. They've sold it all out. It's at roughly exactly where they want it to be. Logically, they would have planned for roughly 50% more units in the United States, right? And also, they would have planned for fairly the same amount of units sold in Europe. If that's the case, that means they have a lot more stock in the United States and Europe, which means if the Switch 2 sold in the same proportion for the rest of the world in the same way that the Switch 1 currently sits at, you would assume that Japan only holds, 24% of the entirety of the Switch 1 market? Let's round it up to an even 25. So that means that 1.7 million that's been sold in Japan should only be 25% of the entire pie. Which means if you take that 1.7 and you multiply it by 4, you get 6.8 million units. Which, need I remind you, is within the ballpark of the amount of units that were predicted to be ready to go at launch. In Japan, this thing is selling exactly as well as they expected. In the United States and in Europe, it's not. And that's why all of a sudden they just pulled a lever and that thing is available everywhere. Because they're realizing they're behind and they need to push this thing as fast as they can. Because yes, the Switch 2 is the fastest selling console for the first month. And that opening launch weekend and those numbers in Japan were so high that it's gonna be the best selling console for the second month. And even probably the third month. But with every passing month, you're going to see that gap shrink because other consoles had to catch up with stock. So like I've been saying, like I've been predicting since launch weekend, this thing is drastically being carried by two things. Number one, it's the fact that its data is largely being skewed by that opening launch weekend. That's where the big records are happening. And number two, it's drastically overperformed in Japan. And I believe personally that Nintendo planned for Japan to sell as much as it does, as much as it did. And they expected that the Switch would do better in the Americas and in Europe in proportion to how well it did in Japan. So all of these records, everything that we're seeing, all of these performances are completely being skewed by what's going on in Japan right now. And obviously that's happening over there because the Switch 2 is cheaper. But in the rest of the world, that's painting a much clearer picture. Because if Japan was underperforming the same way that they were underperforming in America and Europe, basically if Japan did 1.5 times what the Switch 1 did, it would only be at 0.9 million, which means the Switch 2 would have done 4.2 million, which would have been like half of what people were predicting initially. Still a record. Obviously, it's the fastest selling console in the first month, and maybe the second month. Give it to the third or fourth month, we'll see where we are. Either way, there was a lot of math in this one. I hope you were able to keep up. There will probably be another video tomorrow because we'll get the next Famitsu numbers. Thanks again for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.